Some paths lead to unexpected destinations. Sometimes a single decision determines the course of your entire life, and you don't realize how it feels to go down the wrong path until you've already taken the first step. For years, I struggled to make the right choices. When I married Anderson at 38, I had always dreamed of starting a family, of providing my child with a loving home. But Anderson never shared those dreams. At first, he made all the promises a husband should. He said we'd build a life together. However, as time passed, I came to understand that I was no more than a shadow in his life. Anderson never truly placed me or the family we could have had as a priority. His work, his schedule, and his rigid habits always took precedence. Initially, I convinced myself things might change, that one day he'd recognize the emptiness growing inside me. But no, Anderson never changed. He remained exactly the same. As the years went by, I grew increasingly lonely. But then there was Drake, Anderson's son from his first marriage. When we met, he was 19, just starting college. Ambitious, driven, full of potential. Anderson kept his distance, believing that being a father was just about providing money, nothing more. But Drake wanted more. He sought to prove himself, to forge his own path. He was everything Anderson wasn't, and before I knew it, I found myself paying more attention to him. As Drake neared graduation, he made a decision that shifted everything. Everyone thought he'd take a high-paying job in engineering, but instead, he chose to become a mechanic. Anderson lost it when he heard, yelling and even threatening to cut him off financially. I still remember the echoes of that argument shaking the walls of our home. The night after graduation, Drake packed his things and left without a word. I never got the chance to say goodbye, nor did I ask where he was going. If I had shown how much it hurt to see him leave, I would have had to face something else, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. It's been 2 years since he left, and I've only seen him a few times. The bond we shared no longer existed, nor was it meant to. And tonight, as I sat in my broken-down car on a dark, rainy road, I realized there was no one else I could call. I didn't know it then, but everything was about to change, beyond anything I had imagined. And it was all going to happen on its own. I picked up my phone, my finger hovering over Anderson's contact, but after a moment of hesitation, I backed out of the call. Even if he answered, I knew what he'd say. "Call a tow truck, Cameron. I'm far away." He'd hang up without another word. I sighed, staring at the screen before shifting to another name. Drake. A strange feeling stirred inside me as I hovered over his contact. Should I call him? Was this just a request for help or something more? Something unspoken? The rain tapped lightly against the windows, and then, in the glow of my headlights, I saw a tall, strong silhouette approaching through the dark. A strange sense of relief washed over me. Drake reached the car and knocked on the window. I rolled it down just enough, and his steady, familiar voice came through. "Cameron, you okay?" His face was slightly damp from the rain, his features sharper than I remembered. His stance was relaxed but strong. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man. In the 2 years that had passed, it wasn't just the distance between us that had changed. He had changed. "Yeah, the car just stopped suddenly, and I didn't know what to do," I admitted. "I went to visit my mom, and it happened on the way back. Anderson's out of town again, and I didn't call him because I know what he'd say. Call a tow truck, Cameron? He'd probably get annoyed with me, too." Drake tilted his head slightly, understanding in his eyes. "I know why you didn't call him," he said calmly. "Don't worry, I've got this." He leaned in, opening the hood and shining his flashlight on the engine. I watched as his hands moved with precision, muscles flexing with each careful motion. He wasn't just a college kid anymore. There was confidence in every movement, and experience in the way he handled things. "It's pretty clear this isn't going to get fixed here," he finally said, closing the hood. "We'll need to take it to the garage. I'll drive it because the steering might be stiff. You'll sit in the passenger seat. I'll leave my truck here and come back for it later." I didn't question him. I didn't have to. With Drake there, I knew everything would be okay somehow. The air in the car was humid as we drove, but the silence between us wasn't awkward. If anything, it felt like it was bringing us closer, without either of us realizing it. Drake would glance at me now and then, his voice steady as he talked, keeping the conversation flowing and filling the space between us with that same easy presence he'd always had. I listened, watched him, his hands on the wheel, the sound of his voice, the feeling of his presence beside me. When he left 2 years ago, I never allowed myself to admit how much his absence left a hole in me. Anderson had always been distant, but with Drake, it was different. His energy, his voice, his eyes. There was something in them that had awoken something inside me that I hadn't been ready to see. I remembered the night before he left. There had been something between us, something that never crossed a line but could have. That possibility was always there. Now Drake was back, older, more mature, and far more magnetic. A quiet unease stirred inside me, a feeling that wasn't supposed to be there. But it was, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, I could feel it with every breath I took when he was near. By the time we reached the garage, I took a deep breath, trying to regain control as I opened the car door. But there was a voice inside me whispering, "Tonight you're both different, and you both know it." The garage smelled of motor oil and metal, with the rain echoing off the roof. Drake lifted his head from under the hood, wiping the sweat from his forehead before looking at me. There was no fatigue in his eyes, just thoughtfulness. "It's getting late," he said, his voice steady. "If I start fixing this car now, we'll be here until morning. It's better to take care of it first thing tomorrow." I nodded. It wasn't a problem, but something in the way Drake was standing made it clear this wasn't just any ordinary night. "The rain's getting heavier," he added. "Stay here. I'll go with a friend to pick up my truck, then I'll come back for you. I don't want you out here alone." His voice had the quiet authority of a man who noticed the little things. Anderson never would have cared. He would have expected me to figure it out on my own. But Drake was different. When he stepped outside, the silence of the garage settled over me. The rain pounded on the roof as I sat, folding my hands in my lap. Logically, I should have been frustrated or stressed. My car had broken down. It was late, and my plans had fallen apart. But strangely, I didn't care. If anything, I felt at peace. More than that, I felt happy. Why? It was just a car breaking down, an ordinary situation. But tonight, nothing felt ordinary. The way Drake looked at me, the warmth in his voice, the way his presence filled the space. Something inside me was shifting. As I waited, I thought about it. Over the years, Drake had grown into a strong, independent man. But more than that, when he was around, I didn't feel alone. That feeling, whatever it was settling deep within me. The rumble of an engine outside broke my thoughts. Drake pulled up in front of the garage, stepping inside with water dripping from his shoulders, completely unfazed by the rain. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I stood up, pulling my jacket tighter around me, and nodded. We stepped outside together and climbed into the car, and as we drove, the sensation inside me only intensified. I turned toward him, trying to put into words what I was feeling. "You know," I said with a small smile, "when something like this happens, most people would feel frustrated, anxious, or unlucky, but I don't feel that way. Actually, oddly enough, I feel happy." Drake smiled faintly, keeping his attention on the road. "I get it," he responded. "Sometimes, even when it's the wrong time, things can still feel right." His voice was soft, but there was something deeper in it, as if the walls I'd built around my loneliness were falling apart. In that instant, I understood just how distant Anderson had been, how alone I had felt even when he was right there beside me. More importantly, I realized that Drake understood too. The tension between us was undeniable now, and there was an inner pull, a quiet yet persistent urge. I didn't want this night to end. As we neared my house, I took a deep breath, summoning my courage. "Drake, you've been dealing with this for hours. You must be starving," I said, trying not to look away. "Come inside. Let's have dinner together, like we used to." Drake paused, looking at me silently for a moment, a brief hesitation passing before that familiar, warm smile appeared. "How could I say no to that?" he replied, and something inside me sparked with excitement. When we entered and I started preparing dinner in the kitchen, all the stress that should have come from the night just faded away. We laughed, chatted about old memories, reminiscing as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. Every time our eyes met, we both knew it, and there was no going back. The soft glow of the table light flickered over us as we continued talking, laughing like we always had. It felt effortless, familiar, but the air between us wasn't quite the same. Drake leaned back slightly in his chair, crossing his arms as he observed me closely. There was warmth in his gaze, but something more. Something playful. Something knowing. "I have to admit," he said with a smirk, "you look just as beautiful as ever. Actually, it's almost unbelievable. It's like you've gotten even younger these past 2 years. If I didn't know you, I'd think you were maybe 30, and I'd probably be trying to charm you right now." I laughed, caught off guard by the way he'd said it so casually. The unexpected compliment flustered me, but I couldn't deny how much I liked it. "Well, thank you, but I'm 45, I said, still smiling. "There's nearly 20 years between us." He shrugged, his voice dipping lower. "Age is just a number, Cameron," he said. "We both know that." His words sent a wave of warmth through me. The table fell into silence, but it wasn't awkward. It felt heavy, like something was about to shift. Drake tilted his head slightly, his eyes searching me as though he could see straight into something deeper, something neither of us could ignore anymore. "You've changed too," I said finally, trying to steer the conversation, even just a little. "When you left, I could already tell you were starting to mature, but now you're a man." Drake's smile slowly faded, replaced by something more serious. He placed his hand on the table, his fingers lightly tracing its surface, hesitating for a moment before locking his gaze with mine. "I had feelings for you, Cameron," he said. Instantly, something tightened inside me. "I know," he continued. "I was never supposed to say this, but I can't keep it hidden anymore. When I left, I thought if I kept my distance, I would forget. I thought it was just a temporary thing, that it would fade with time, but it didn't." He took a deep breath, his eyes holding me captive. "And now, seeing you like this, so alone, believe me, it kills me inside." My heart pounded, my world splitting in two. One part of me told me to run, but the other, one I barely recognized, wanted nothing more than to sit there and listen to every word he said. "Drake, I couldn't finish, his intense stare leaving me breathless. Without thinking, my hand stretched across the table, reaching for his. Drake caught it, his skin warm and strong, and in that moment, everything went still. We moved in unison as we leaned forward, stealing one last look before closing our eyes, and then our lips met. At first, it was slow and hesitant, but within seconds, everything we'd suppressed, every ounce of tension ignored for years, was unleashed all at once. Drake cupped my face, pulling me closer. My body instinctively responded to him, drawn to his warmth. The more I felt it, the more I realized something deep inside me, something I had lost for years, was coming back to life. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. As our lips remained locked, I could feel something awakening inside me, something I'd silenced for so long. My hands moved on their own, sliding down his shoulders as he pulled me against him, firm and sure. I moved closer, staring into his eyes as I noticed his hand moving slowly. The excitement inside me grew, a deep and overwhelming feeling. Even though I felt a sharp, intense pain, I didn't care. Everything kept moving forward. I let out loud breaths, and matching my energy, I kept breathlessly thanking Drake. I could see the joy in his eyes. We had found each other, completely in sync. I pressed my hands against his shoulders, aware of my nails digging into him, feeling my body tense and tremble. I hadn't expected this reaction, but I could tell Drake loved it. I began begging him to let go, to stop holding back. Then he said my name, Cameron, his voice trailing off as he finally let go. A deep warmth spread inside me, and I took a deep breath, collapsing beside him. As I lay next to Drake, my heart still raced, our breaths uneven, but inside I felt a peace I couldn't describe. Feeling him so close to me was like finding a missing piece that had been gone for years. Drake turned to face me, locking eyes as his hand slid into my hair, gently tracing my face. There was certainty in his gaze, a look that said this was real. that this wasn't just some temporary escape. Cameron, he said softly, you need to leave Anderson. Something inside me tightened. I had been waiting for him to say it, but even so, the words hung in the air. He doesn't deserve you, Drake continued. He never did. He left you alone for years, never showed you love, turned your life into a shadow of what it could have been. You don't deserve that life. I tried to speak, but he didn't let me. If you do this, we can start over somewhere new, in a country where no one knows us. I don't care about anything else. I love you, Cameron. I can't stand seeing you sad and alone anymore. I locked eyes with him, the sincerity in his voice, the longing in his eyes. It shook me to my core. A warmth spread inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope? Was this an escape? Maybe, but it was also a chance. I was staring at the possibility of happiness I had never known. I took a deep breath and smiled. Drake. The words got caught in my throat, but in that moment, our eyes spoke for us. Our hands found each other, fingers entwined. This story wasn't over. There was more to come, and this time it was going even further. Stay tuned for what happens next. If you've made it this far, you know this story hits deep. There's so much more to share, and you won't want to miss any of it. So make sure to follow, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts on the story. As the sun gently sank beneath the horizon, I was busy preparing dinner in the kitchen. I chopped vegetables and mixed sauces when Sebastian entered. His presence seemed heavier than the spices filling the air, and his return after being away for some time brought a strange comfort, a bittersweet sense of relief. He was no longer the little boy I used to tuck in at night. Now he was back from university, exuding a new sense of maturity and adulthood that surrounded us in an unspoken way. He had grown into a young man, grounded and confident, no longer needing my care. I turned to look at him, and something in his quiet gaze stopped me. There was a depth in his eyes I couldn't place. He sat there, watching me, his expression no longer the same as when he used to look at me over breakfast. I missed that innocent look, the curiosity that once sparked when he followed me around, asking questions as I made breakfast. Now, that curiosity had been replaced with something I couldn't name. We talked about trivial things during dinner, the kind of small talk meant to keep the atmosphere light. But every time he looked at me, it felt as if his gaze was cutting through my thoughts, sensing the strange barrier that had grown between us. That unspoken wall held something we both couldn't say. After dinner, he suggested we watch an old movie we used to enjoy when he was younger. I agreed, and as we sat together in the dim light, I couldn't ignore how much he had changed. He had grown, and deep down, I found myself torn between my role as a mother and some other feeling I wasn't ready to name. At one point, he placed his hand near mine, barely brushing against it. The touch was innocent enough, yet something inside me stirred, and I didn't understand why. I quickly pulled my hand away, feeling a tremor in my fingers, and a wave of shame washed over me. I shouldn't feel this way. I couldn't feel this way. My thoughts weighed on me, so I made an excuse about being tired and left for bed, hoping sleep would clear my mind. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling by making coffee. Sebastian came in, looking at me with the same serious expression from the night before, a gaze that seemed to see too much. When he asked if I wanted to go for a walk, I hesitated. Ignoring the growing tension between us wasn't working. And maybe the familiar walking path we used to take would help us find our way back to normal. As we walked through the trees, memories of our old times together flooded my mind. Picnics, the carefree laughter he had as a child. But somehow those memories made the present even more apparent. We had both changed. As the sun set, we turned back towards the house, walking mostly in silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the soft wind. By the time we reached home, it was dark, and we stepped inside quietly, as if we had both hit an invisible barrier. I went to the stove, and the sound filled the quiet space. Sebastian stood by the door, his serious expression even more intense. I felt his gaze on me, and I suddenly wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped closer, his eyes heavy with something too complicated for either of us to understand. We stood there for what felt like an eternity until he finally spoke. His voice was soft but steady. "Mom," he said, taking a deep breath. "Sometimes I feel like you look at me differently, like something's changed." His words shocked me, and I wanted to comfort him, but I also knew we couldn't cross this line. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sebastian, you're my son," I whispered. "I'm your mother." I repeated it to myself, holding on to those words like a lifeline, even though something inside me felt like it was breaking. Sebastian looked down for a moment, then back at me. His voice was barely a whisper when he replied, "I know, but sometimes there are things I feel that I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. And just saying it out loud feels strange." I could feel the weight of his struggle, the tension in his voice as if he was speaking to himself as much as to me. Every part of me wanted to reach out, to tell him everything would be okay, to hold him like I used to, but I knew he couldn't go back. I had to protect him, from both of us. I met his gaze, trying to keep my tone both firm and gentle. "Sebastian," I said, "we can't be anything else. You know that, don't you?" He nodded slowly, a sad smile pulling at the corners of his lips. "Yeah," he said softly. "I do. It's just hard to control how you feel sometimes." The silence that followed felt heavy, like a living thing, binding us together in a way words couldn't. There was a weight to everything we had said and hadn't said, everything we felt but couldn't act on. I knew that this moment would stay with us, a reminder that some boundaries must be respected, no matter the emotions in our hearts. As the night deepened and the silence wrapped around us, I realized some things are best left as quiet memories. When I finally went to bed, a rush of excitement filled me, one I couldn't shake. I lay down, trying to close my eyes, but my mind raced. Sebastian's gaze, the way he stood so close, the warmth he gave off, all of it played on repeat in my mind. My heart pounded, and I couldn't quite explain what I was feeling, even to myself. As a mother, I shouldn't feel this way. But the more I thought of him, the harder it was to keep it buried. Is this love? Just motherly love? Or is there something more? Honestly, I was freaked out by how much I was questioning myself. A battle raged in my mind, and I knew I had to push these feelings down, return to the familiar, simple love I had always known. But alone in the stillness of the night, these tangled emotions crept up again, and I wasn't sure how I would feel come morning. I knew I needed to find the strength to stay firm, to keep things as they should be. But part of me wondered, what if I just let myself feel? Would that be so wrong?